Some parts of East Anglia are losing the coast at a rate of 4 metres a year, so it's very palpable. Growing up, say, 15, 17 miles inland, you could go to certain places on the coast where you see sugar beet on the beach because the fields had fallen onto the beach. And we grow up in East Anglia with this knowledge of lost villages under the sea. So the nearest one to us was Dunwich, and there's a legend that a church bell would ring at certain times under the sea.
Hello, and welcome to Collected, the podcast about writing from the Royal Literary Fund. I'm Jonathan Tulloch, and with me today is Katharine Quarmby, editor, journalist, and novelist who's just been shortlisted, I understand, for a prize.
Yes, that's right. I'm on the shortlist for the New Angle Prize for Literature, which is for books set in or influenced by the East Anglian landscape. So yeah, I'm really chuffed to be on the shortlist with some other just lovely books.
So a really newsworthy event in the writing world is the Ides of March, 15th of March, like obviously from Shakespeare and everything. But is there a date? Do you attach much significance to dates as a writer?
I'm now feeling like I should beware the Ides of March, but I'll try not to. I suppose for me, it is that sense of the school year, actually, which is still very important to me, very evocative, that idea of going back to school. And in fact, when we work for the Royal Literary Fund, there's also that sense of going back for the university term. So I suppose for me, that's a big date.
Did you have a nice time at school?
It was really mixed, my time at school. I went from living with my family in Leicestershire, which was sort of idyllic for me until I was about 7. And then we moved to Norfolk, and I found the transition really difficult. At first, I went from having like a really close friend to feeling quite isolated. And that took a few years to bounce back from. And I found East Anglia at first very different from sort of a close mining community in Leicestershire as it was then. But I grew to really love it, both the landscape and friends who I still have from school, in fact.
That came up trumps with your latest book, the whole like East Anglian scenario.
Yeah, I suppose you're always trying as a writer to sort of reduce the gap between what you feel and what you put down on paper. And, for me, East Anglia's in my bones now, and I wanted to try and capture it.
And is the season of March, early spring, is that in your bones as well? Do you like, is the season important to you, or do you just like any time of year is okay?
I really love the spring, actually. I have a late spring birthday, and I've got all these connections with sort of lovely picnics and happy days right at the beginning of when you can sit outside and go to the park and things. So I love spring.
Yeah, it's. I think Sylvia Plath said that March is the time when she can be human. Maybe that's an invitation to us all to feel human at this time of year. So we'll be listening to something from the RLF archive. We've got a huge bank of recordings of writers who talk fascinatingly about the writing life and what it's like for them. And it really gives us a sense of the 4 seasons of the writer's life. So I'd like us now to listen to a writer called Carl Whitney talking about rejection.
Whenever I'm about to open a letter from a publisher to which I sent a proposal, or an email from an editor to whom I pitched an idea, I take a moment to steel myself for rejection. Here we go, I think, and take a deep breath. Several years ago, I wrote a non-fiction book proposal and bundled it with a few pages of sample material. I sent it off to a publisher that seemed particularly suitable for the kind of book I was writing, an exploration of my home city of Dublin, and eventually received an envelope in response from that publisher. Inside the envelope was an A4 sheet of headed notepaper on which was printed a stock rejection of the kind they must have sent to most other writers whose proposal or manuscript never made it beyond the slush pile. A year or so later, the same proposal, the same book, was accepted for publication by a publisher. In fact, the same publisher that had initially rejected me. What changed? You could say that it was the fact that I had spent the time between rejection and acceptance working on further sample material. But my recollection is that I thought of the rejection as definitive, and I decided instead to work on a series of articles based on the chapter outlines. Fairly certain that it wasn't to be a book, I concentrated on what I actually could do, pitch long pieces to literary journals, rather than on the elusive book deal. I kept the book proposal on file, tinkering with it occasionally. Eventually, an editor at the publisher asked if I was working on a book, and I was able to send him a proposal, and that led to a deal. The irony wasn't lost on me, but I also recognized both the arbitrary nature of the pitch. The person who rejects a proposal one day might look more positively on it the next, or your proposal might simply find its way to the right or wrong person. And the fact that what I was proposing a year on from the rejection was significantly more fleshed out, more convincing. There was more sample material included for a start, and more of a track record of publication. The two were connected. The published work made up much of the sample material. It looked more like a book, in other words, and that's important when you're a writer who hasn't written one before. Rejection is familiar to every writer. It was already familiar to me when I first sent out my book proposal, as it is to so many other freelance journalists who pitch ideas to editors. Sometimes you can learn something from rejection, sometimes you can't. Often it's nothing to do with you or the quality of your writing. It just doesn't fit a certain editor at a certain publisher on a certain day. Others will be interested, even if it takes some time to find them. That said, unremitting rejection can be an overwhelmingly bleak experience. How does one cope with that? Perhaps it's useful to have a variety of projects underway and at different stages. Switching to something else, beginning a new proposal, writing some reviews, penning a light opera, could be a way of putting a rejected idea aside for a while before you go back into battle. I ask myself what I've learned from rejection. It might seem an obvious point, but there's a need to persist, and by persistence, I mean continuing to pursue your own ideas and ultimately to value your work highly, regardless of the response. Because no matter who you are and how long you've been writing, there'll be other rejections to come. The ideal state would be to pay scant notice to rejection and acceptance alike, to be above all that, to take everything in your stride. But we're only human. Don't over-anticipate rejection, but don't be too surprised by it either. If it comes, or rather when it comes, as it undoubtedly will, accept it, shrug, and move on.
Wise words, Carl. Yes, but words that we all need to hear as writers. I bet you've heard them yourself a few times, Katharine.
Yeah, I mean, dealing with rejection is like this absolute basic part of being a writer and a journalist, actually, both, and also I've learned as an editor to reject people's work
the
myself.
Other side.
Yeah.
From the dark side, right.
And I suppose one of the things I've really realised is that it's important to do that as swiftly as you can, let people out of their misery, because we haven't really talked about the ghost element to rejection, which is being ghosted. So you don't know whether your work is being rejected or what's happened to it, which is kind of perhaps a new phenomenon, but quite an unpleasant one, really.
Yeah, it's one that's increasing as well, isn't it? So what's worse then, like rejecting someone else or being rejected?
I mean, I haven't enjoyed rejecting other people, but I do see it as part of a job. Or actually, as an editor, you can also sometimes say, this isn't right for me, but it is a really good piece of work. Or you could go away and work on it and send it to another publication. So sometimes you can also work out what's the way you can give some feedback that can help that person find perhaps their top line if it's journalism that wasn't quite clear, or maybe find the sort of nub of what the book is that wasn't quite clear. I haven't obviously worked as a book editor, but I'm just wondering, because rejections vary in quality, don't they?
Yes, they do. Yeah, and what we do with them varies. Have you found a difference in dealing with rejection or processing rejection in like fiction, your fictional work and your journalistic work? Is there a contrast between that?
With journalism, so I tend to now be working with publications I've worked with before. It's always more difficult working with people you haven't worked before because they won't necessarily work with you to improve what you're writing. You're more likely to get a swift flat no with journalism. With fiction, I found it quite hard to take rejection after rejection. It is hard. And I think one of the things that Carl Whitney said, which I thought was interesting, was this issue about if you get a number of rejections, you can maybe start another project. And to some extent, I completely agree with that. But I think there's also an issue about whether you can commit yourself fully to something if you have a lot of projects on the go at any one time. So I feel like one of the ways I guard against the pain of rejection is to start another project.
Instead a light opera? Have you written many light operas?
Never light operas, but I think there's something about if something's difficult, maybe you need to go deeper. But that's hard when you've been rejected for writing it in the first place.
What advice could you give to a young writer, maybe being rejected for the first time?
That you'll be rejected again. I mean,
and again.
One musician family member said to me, you just have to pitch and forget, because with music, it's exactly the same. So you have to learn, you have to be someone who can take rejection and try and learn the right lessons from it, because it won't be the same every time.
Yes, I think that's good advice. It's like dealing with AI or a robot. The rejection's not aimed at you, it's not human. It's just part of the process. What would we be without rejection? What would Van Gogh be? Maybe it's part and parcel.
Maybe it keeps us humble as well, because I think many writers have said they could paper a room with their rejections, and that means that the people who rejected you, not that they were wrong, but they didn't have that passion for your work that would have helped them be a good editor of it.
No, that's good. So let it go. Don't give someone power because they've forgotten about you. There's also something about, say if you keep on writing something and it just is rejected, it's like a bird singing in the forest is still singing even if no one else can hear it.
Yes, and that's going to be a question more and more, isn't it? As there's more and more books published every year, is why are you writing?
That's a good question for you, because when I was looking at the stuff you've been doing, like the thing about, say, for instance, the asbestos in pipes, and then things you've been doing about like hate crime and everything. So that's different because you can't really give up on that kind of thing, can you?
Yeah. So I work with a European team of environmental journalists on journalism to do really with climate change and some of the legacies of past issues like pesticides, asbestos, and now we're looking at flooding together.
How do you come together?
So the European collaborations are something that I'm so glad to be part of. So I got involved as an English language editor, so someone sort of shaping how the investigations could be written in English, working with journalists from all over Europe. I think it was 9 or 10 European countries, the first big investigation. And then from that, I started to do the reporting in the UK, as well as the editing of the overall sort of overview piece, which is something where we pull in information from all the different reports from all over Europe. So with the asbestos, I think we've done, by that I mean the European investigation team that I work with on asbestos, we've done 3 separate but linked investigations on the sort of legacy of asbestos, which is a collection of minerals that are lethal for human health. And I won't ever give up on it now, because I realise how important it is that we deal with these sort of legacies of the Industrial Revolution and beyond that still have the power to harm us today. And some of those issues like asbestos will only get worse with the climate crisis, because they can be damaged and become present in the world again after we kind of buried them in landfills. So there is never an end to the stories about something like asbestos.
And you're also doing, this is great because I love the way you've done like a historical novel in contrast to this stuff which is so germane for sort of like the now. Flooding. You mentioning to me about the flooding and the problems that are coming in that way that you've been investigating.
Yes, so the new project that the European team now is working on is looking at really how should we hold back the water. And again, this is about climate adaptation. And we in England, we are an island, and so we are a particularly watery place. And that's a very beautiful thing, but it also means that it's quite a dangerous thing for us as an island. And that's been really interesting to work on, and to see some of the projects in places like the Netherlands where they've effectively decided to make room for water. we are at a moment where we are going to see sea level rise that will change the British landscape. And I think most of us haven't really got the headspace or had the headspace yet to realise how our very landscape, the places that we love, will change in the next 50 to 100 to 200 years.
And it's quite personal for you, isn't it? Because East Anglia is somewhere it's part of you, as you say, it's in your bones. And that's going to be really impacted, isn't it?
Yeah, so some parts of East Anglia are losing the coast at a rate of 4 metres a year. So it's very palpable. Growing up, say, 15, 17 miles inland from the coast, you could go to certain places on the coast where you see sugar beet on the beach because the fields had fallen onto the beach. And we grow up in East Anglia with this knowledge of lost villages under the sea. So the nearest one to us was Dunwich, and there's a legend that a church bell would ring at certain times under the sea. So it's got a huge power for anyone who's got links with East Anglia.
The church bell ringing. See, I can hear the novelist in you coming out there, ringing like a bell under the sea. How long did you spend researching your novel, The Low Road?
The Low Road took years to research and write. So it was 7 years really from beginning to end. But I think that was partly because sort of events intervened in that we had a series of family bereavements in the middle. And I had to go back to work completely full time because I ended up being the sole wage earner. And so there was a lot of things that meant I had to concentrate on just keeping the family going and recovering from sort of multiple bereavements. But I did also really enjoy the research. I really enjoyed the historical research. I probably went through a few archival rabbit holes I didn't need to go to.
Can you give us a little sense of what it's about?
So The Low Road starts with a story that I uncovered in my hometown, which is a market town in the Waveney Valley in Norfolk. And I just found a reference to a walk to the end of the town. And there 2 people were buried. One was a man and one was a woman who had been buried after being suspected of infanticide. And she had then taken poison and died by suicide herself, and that was then buried at what was then called the end of the town. And that just really intrigued me. I had her name, but I also had the initial of her one remaining child, so the one who hadn't died, she was just called AT. And I just thought, I want to know what happened to this child, this orphaned girl. And that's how it really started. And I then traced, she was called Anne Tyrrell. I traced her and very quickly found that she had later been transported to Botany Bay, as it was then called, to Australia in 1828. So her mother had been buried in this unmarked grave in 1813. So I had the bookends of the story, but then I wanted to kind of fill in what had happened to this orphan girl.
Did you feel a responsibility to the real people who that had happened to? Because often, like, a novelist will just purely make things up. You know, how did you feel about your subject?
I think I felt about her the way I often do about the people I interview, actually, for journalism, that I had a responsibility to tell her story and with as much respect as possible. And there was something else, I think, with her, though, which was that she and her mother had been so dishonoured by society at the time, and their lives had been controlled by male authority figures, and I wanted to give her back a voice. And that was something I don't feel with people I interview. They have a voice. All I'm doing is trying to surface that voice. But here, I was trying to kind of restore this lost voice from history.
Are you happy with how you've managed it? I mean, do you feel as though you've really got the sort of like what needed to be said and their side of it?
So this was my debut novel. So I would never say that I was totally happy. There's a lot, it's very grim in the middle. When Anne moves to London, there's joy, but there's also a lot of pain. And I think now I would probably kinch in the middle in London and expand Australia. But these are the things, like I remember the playwright Sarah Daniels saying to me once at some writing workshop that no piece of art is ever finished. It's just that it's just as good as you can get it.
That's very good. Yeah, I like that. So what's your next fictional foray?
It's 3 linked novels, the first of which is actually also set in East Anglia, but in the recent past, so in the 1980s. and then with a time shift to the early 2000s around the time of the London bombings. So it's working between those two dates. And then there's a prequel set in a place that I worked in when I went to Germany just after school, so between school and university, which was what I thought was a care home, and I later found out had actually been a concentration camp. So I'm trying to write two things at the same time and finding that a bit challenging.
Gosh, well, good luck.
Thank you.
That'll take something. I'm sure you'll do it. So, just in the light of how long it takes to research something and how you have to craft something intellectually, really, and emotionally, by the sound of it, I'd like us to listen to a talk by Rosie Fiore-Burt on how a tower in the shadow of St. Paul's Cathedral in London fed into her research on the history of the death industry.
If you approach St. Paul's Cathedral from the east, you'll come upon a rather forbidding 60s glass and concrete edifice. This is the Cathedral School, which numbers among its pupils the junior choristers of St. Paul's. At one corner of the school building, there's an incongruous old tower. This is all that remains of the Church of St. Augustine's and St. Faith's. Like much of the city, what wasn't permanently lost to the Great Fire was destroyed in the Blitz. So it was for St. Augustine and St. Faith's, which was bombed in 1941, leaving just the tower standing. While it's part of the school, it's not used as an entrance. 5 steps rise to double doors which are permanently locked. There are no windows, so I can't glimpse what's inside. I wrote a letter to the school asking to see it, which went unanswered. Why do I care about this obscure architectural leftover? Some years ago, I began thinking about the funeral industry and the rise of the undertaking trade. I was struck by the odd rituals we still observe, redolent with Victorian symbolism, and about a lucrative industry dominated by men. Had it always been this way? My research led me to a paper by Wanda Henry entitled Women's Searchers of the Dead in 18th and 19th Century London. So, what on earth was a searcher of the dead? Following an edict from the Lord Mayor in 1578, each of the parishes of the City of London appointed 2 women as searchers. They were ordered to attend every death in the parish and determine and record the cause of death. Initially, this was to track the progress of the plague, but over time, all causes of death were gathered in a weekly report called the Bills of Mortality. The bills provide a fascinating record of illnesses, accidents, and crimes through the ages. They sometimes pop up on social media as people marvel at the archaic terms. Who wouldn't be fascinated by the 19 people who died of rising of the lights in August 1665, or the 10 who perished from King's Evil, not to mention imposthume, tisic, or sore leg? A bit of searching reveals that rising of the lights is pneumonia, lights being lungs, and rising meaning filling with fluid. King's Evil is related to the swollen lymph glands associated with TB. Imposthume is an abscess, tisic is a cough, and sore leg is, well, sore leg. Same ailments we have today, just different names. The searchers were often ridiculed. In his 1974 essay, The Searchers, Thomas Forbes records, "A correspondent in the Gentleman's Magazine in 1799 complained, 'In 2 parishes which I could point out, the searchers cannot write. The mistakes they make are numberless in the spelling of Christian and surnames, for they trust to memory till they get home. Then child or neighbour writes what they suppose it to be. Even the search was perfunctory. They only look at the face, inquire the disorder, and receive their fee.' But in a spectacular case of doublethink, historians also regard the bills of mortality built on data gathered by these searchers to be accurate historical record. Surely, I thought, they can't all have been ignorant. If you observed death over decades, you'd gain knowledge and experience. Would some of the searchers not have been self-taught forensic scientists, pathologists of days gone by?" Wanda Henry's paper identified many women who fulfilled the role in churches throughout the city. One name she unearthed caught my eye, Kezia Peppercorn, who became searcher and pew opener at St. Augustine's and St. Faith's in 1832, following the death of her mother Elizabeth. Could Kezia become the central character of a novel, an eagle-eyed, experienced searcher who spots wrongdoing where others ignore it, an 18th century silent witness who gives voice to the voiceless dead?
Searchers of the dead, the bills of mortality. That's great stuff, Rosie. Thank you. That's really evocative.
So evocative. I mean, Rosie Fioribert just conjured up a whole world, didn't she, in that short clip?
She's definitely a great character. That, do you I sense a real excitement and spark of creativity in that kind of research? Do you experience that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that archival research or this very, parallel research feels very creative, very exciting. So I went to the National Archives in Kew to find my two girls, as they became two girls who met at the Refuge for the Destitute in Hackney and ended up on a prison hulk, which was very unusual for girls. And I found a parchment paper which had their pardon from Sir Robert Peel on it. And to just sort of undo that ribbon, which had probably not been undone very often. They were just poor girls. Nobody cared about these kind of girls. And to read that pardon with the names of the other women, girls and women who'd been imprisoned first in the Millbank Penitentiary and then on two prison hulks was just felt incredible. It's just a kind of magic, isn't it, that all those archives exist and we can go and visit them.
Were you able to get close to their physical life? Could you get to the prison where they were, or the stretch of the Thames where the ship was, or anything like that?
So in fact, it was very difficult to find any bits of landscape that still existed in the way that they had in Georgian London. The Millbank Penitentiary, where the two girls were imprisoned for a few years, is underneath Tate Britain. So I've been back there. Yeah, and there's a pub nearby where the prison guards apparently used to go underneath the penitentiary through corridors into the pub. So I went to the pub. There's a bit of the wall left. There's the trench, which would have been one of the trenches around the prison, still exists, and people hang their washing out there. And the Refuge for the Destitute, where Anne Tyrrell arrived as a young girl in London, in Hackney, there's nothing there at all. It's just, an alleyway. The way I got closest was to go onto Layers of London, which is sort of old maps, and at least there find some sense of the streets that they would have walked. But you have to sort of imagine your way back almost with paintings and so on that far back.
Yeah.
So I did as much as I could. And the archives were really useful too.
The map sounds interesting because I don't really know much about the history of London, but presumably it's changed a lot in 200 years.
Yeah, and the Layers of London, you can superimpose layers on top of each other, much as you might do in, say, Photoshop. So you can see how even the street names have changed over time. And obviously new streets appear. So you can see these ghosts of places that used to exist. I find that really interesting. And that of now, there was only one picture even of the Refuge for the Destitute in East London, and that was in the background of another picture of some almshouses. It was like the lives of poor young women and poor young girls and boys was not something of note in the 1800s. To think that this girl who had seen her mother sort of cruelly treated in life and in death, who had then pilfered in the town where I lived and was then sent away as an orphan girl to Hackney, near where my kids went to school. It really touches me. We were 200 years apart, but it felt like she was there for me to tell her story.
Even when you say the word pilfer, some of the history just suddenly in the studio here takes shape, because it's a word that it doesn't really have much context now. It's almost humorous, so pilfering. But what would have happened to you? What happened to those young women when they pilfered?
Pilfering could lead you to be sent away. So in the case of Anne, she pilfered in my hometown a few years after she was orphaned, and the people of Harleston took up a collection and sent her away from the town. So it was her first banishment, you could say. And then later, when she stole from the Refuge for the Destitute, where she ended up with this other girl called Annie, they ended up in the Old Bailey for that, and that was then called the crime of grand larceny. They had
That's
stolen
more than pilfering.
Yeah, there was 2 whole bundles of washing that they stole from the laundry. So they went about it on a slightly bigger scale.
Laundry. Yeah, when I think of in Oliver Twist, when they go out, the Artful Dodger, and they just take a handkerchief, and yet they're risking everything.
Yes, and repeat crimes obviously got treated more and more seriously, much as they are now. So the more that you did one thing, the more likely it was that the punishment would become bigger. So Anne then has her second banishment, effectively, which is when she's effectively transported to Australia years later. So she's banished first from her hometown, and then she's banished again beyond these shores, I think they called it.
Rosie said she drew a blank when she tried to contact the school and she didn't get any answer. Have you drawn blanks like that in your research?
Yes, I did draw some blanks. And in fact, that was really the decision why I sort of took a leap from non-fiction to fiction, was because I traced these girls to the Old Bailey. I traced them to the female penitentiary, and I traced them to the prison hulks, and I traced them to their release. And then they kind of almost completely disappear from history. So at that point, I had to decide, I know that at least one of them has been transported to Australia. I'm going to have to go with them to Australia and tell that story as a mosaic of convict life.
So did you head for Australia?
So I was lucky enough to get a grant to go to Australia, which I'm so grateful for, because these kind of writing grants are like gold dust, aren't they? I travelled to Australia in 2018 and I visited two sort of different locations. One was New South Wales, so the Hunter Valley, north of Sydney, and the other was to go to what was called in Georgian times Van Diemen's Land and is now Tasmania. And the reason for going to two different places was, I suppose, firstly, I wanted to give the two girls two different places where they could have been transported, which was the case as well in real life, that a lot of people were transported to Tasmania. And the other was to give them sort of different fates, because 26,000 women were transported to Australia.
How many?
26,000. I wanted to give some sense of the different outcomes.
Which one did you gel with the most? Did you feel the most sort of like rich for you?
For me, going to the Hunter Valley, north of Sydney, so Newcastle, in fact, and beyond, was just the landscape. Even though it had eucalyptus trees rather than oak trees, it felt like a landscape I could almost vision for my Anne Tyrrell would have been like going back to East Anglia. In Indigenous times, there wouldn't have been cows and sheep there, but those animals were taken over. So good cattle and sheep were taken over to Australia and have become sort of part of that new landscape, with all of the iniquity that has also entailed. But she would have seen, by the time she arrived there in the 1820s, a landscape that had the cattle and sheep that she would have seen in East Anglia. So for her, there's a sort of element of circularity, I suppose.
Yes. Did the cattle go in the same coffin ships as the humans?
I'm not entirely sure, but I know that MacArthur, who was a very sort of important person in the territories, brought out a whole flock of sheep. So I imagine at some point it became a quite easy journey, a relatively easy journey, very well travelled. They knew how long it was going to take. They knew how to, survive on the way. So I imagine they could bring out enough of both cattle and sheep to start all over again.
One of the really nitty-gritty aspects of being a writer, as well as rejection, there's another thing that writers have to do, and that's to carve up their day so that they can do especially for you, all the different things. Which part of the day, how do you operate? When are office hours open?
I mean, office hours start relatively early for me in terms of writing. So as early in the morning as I can get up, and that will vary a little bit between summer and winter, I think.
So how
early?
Well. What's the earliest?
So the earliest would only ever be 8, and probably when it's dark, maybe a little bit later.
10, 11?
Not that late, because I want to get going. But then I'll definitely break at 10 for a cup of coffee, and then try and keep writing as much as possible without distractions till lunchtime. And then I feel like I'm a bit wiped out at that point, and I need to go and get some fresh air. And then the afternoon for me is a sort of different time. I can edit, or I can do journalism in the afternoons, or I've just been doing some journalism interviews no problem in the afternoons. But to do anything creative, I feel like it has to be in the morning, and I'm almost superstitious about that.
So really, it's like deeply embedded.
Yeah, it's like I feel weird if I haven't written. I feel like, I haven't done that thing that I should do. And it starts to make me feel quite impatient and a bit narky if I haven't actually done any writing.
So the answer is to do the writing.
Yeah, and not to dodge it too much.
So you sound quite disciplined.
Yeah, well, I've never had a private income. And I think because of that, I've always had to earn everything. And I've had to earn enough to give myself the time to do writing. And I've never had massive advances for any of my books. So I've always thought, I've got to work to make this work. So that time, I've earned that time.
What about holidays? How many weeks do you not write in?
So I don't have a lot of holidays, I'd say, because of being self-employed. Holidays mean that you don't earn anything. You don't get paid leave. So I try and now take more time off. But I do try and now take Friday afternoons off, which I really like. And I try and take the odd week here and there.
And as time goes by, so say, for instance, when your children were at home, was the writing the same? Would it be the same for you, or have things evolved slightly?
When my children were much younger, I suppose I was also writing more books for children, which I have returned to recently, actually. But I had, obviously the school day was a different discipline, but I just remember how long the school holidays were. And just that first day when they were back in September was like, yes, they're back. This is great. However much I enjoyed the school holiday, it was so nice to have that time back as well.
And that's what you were saying at the beginning about how you relate to the year on that sort of academic timetable.
Yeah, very much so. I do still feel it's like there's that lovely moment when the air gets a little bit colder and crisper, and you feel like sharpening pencils, even if you don't use pencils. And, you're like, right, back to work now.
And because it's autumn, the birds are no longer singing, because you were saying before we started going on air that sometimes the birds distract you.
The birds distract me a lot, actually. I mean, I have binoculars and I spend a lot of time just looking at the blue tits, and there's some allotments just at the back of the garden, and spend a lot of time looking at which birds are in the plum tree there and so on. And I get really distracted, and I have a bird app on my phone, and that's really distracting. But I just absolutely adore birds. I adore the natural world. It's one of the deepest pleasures of my life is being in the open air and hearing birds and being by water and so on.
Here. I quite concur with that. And now here's Anne Morgan with the latest RLF news.
An occult artist, wartime Paris, and crofting are among the topics featured in the latest titles by Royal Literary Fund Fellows. Bloomsbury has published Jill Dawson's new novel Pixie, a feminist reclamation of the life story of neglected artist, publisher and tarot illustrator Pamela Pixie Coleman-Smith. Dawson will be discussing the book at Cambridge Literary Festival on Wednesday the 18th of March. Meanwhile, Jane Rogoyska's Hotel Exile, Paris in the Shadow of War, has been published by Allen Lane Penguin. It tells the story of the only grand hotel on Paris's bohemian left bank, a place for musicians, politicians and artists including André Gide, James Joyce, Picasso and Matisse, which became a focus for some of the most dramatic and terrible events of the Second World War. In poetry, Jim Carruth's long-awaited verse novella, Knocan, has been published by Tapsell Theory Press. Rooted in the landscape and geology of northwest Scotland, it is an original and powerful exploration of the story of a crofter and her estranged daughter. For more information, visit the publisher's websites. An RLF Fellows radio play about a photographer who helped shape America's civil rights movement has been broadcast on BBC Radio 4 as part of their Secrets and Lies season. Solby River's Double Exposure tells the story of Ernest Withers, who took the photo that was said to inspire Rosa Parks, as well as the first photos of Martin Luther King on a desegregated Montgomery bus, and pictures of the Little Rock Nine, the March Against Fear, and the sanitation workers' strike. Starring Steve Toussaint and Aisha Anthony, Double Exposure is available to listen now on BBC Sounds. The latest RLF Collected Live event takes place in Durham later this month. Dr. Christy Ducker, Kathleen Jones and Harry Mann will discuss their favourite books and routes into publication while delving into the Royal Literary Fund's growing archive of writers talking about the writing life. Titled The Writing Habit, Conversations with Writers from the Royal Literary Fund, the event will take place at 7:30pm on Wednesday the 25th of March at the appropriately named Collected Bookshop on the Riverwalk, a small independent shop which began life as a mobile shop in a van and now exclusively sells writing by women. Tickets cost £5 and can be purchased at collectedbooks.co.uk. 2 writers associated with the Royal Literary Fund have been shortlisted for the 2026 Ruth Rendell Award, honouring authors who have significantly influenced and championed literacy in the last year. RLF fellow Maisie Chan and Laura Henry Allen MBE of Writers' Mosaic are both in the running for the accolade, which was launched in 2016 by the Authors Licensing and Collecting Society, ALCS, and the National Literacy Trust, in honour of the best-selling crime author and literacy advocate Ruth Rendell. Previous winners include Andy McNabb, Cressida Cowell, Chris Smith and Greg James. For more information, visit alcs.co.uk. And finally, an RLF fellow has taken up a residency at UEA's British Centre for Literary Translation. As translator in residence, Rosalind Harvey will spend 4 months working on a non-fiction book about translation and therapy. In addition, she will contribute to the programme of public events offered by the BCLT, which includes literary translation workshops as well as research seminars and symposia, and she'll write a regular blog. For more information, visit uea.ac.uk. And now, back to the studio.
Well, look, Katharine, thank you very much. That was really wide-ranging and fascinating. And I'm going to go walk away from here thinking of the birds. And since it's March, I'm going to be listening out for the birds, blue tits and all.
You've been listening to Collected, the podcast about writing from the Royal Literary Fund. If you'd like to share any comments or questions, please use the hashtag RLFCollected on our social media channels. The music was composed by Andy Glenn. There was research by Nicola Baldwin and post-production by James Robertson. Our producer was Anne Morgan.